Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So this video I intend to be useful as sort of a comprehensive microeconomics final exam review session. So I'm going to kind of start at the very beginning with a circular flow model and then talk about kind of all the topics that I'd cover. Well, the majority of the topics that I would cover in a microeconomics one-term class. And if I remember, I'll try to put in timestamps or something so it's a little bit easier to be efficient. A lot of the stuff that I've got here is going to be reflected in the Exam 1 and the Exam 2 review videos that I made. I guess I probably should have planned a little bit better how I was going to structure each of these. But then I figured, well, a lot of people are going to want kind of the standalone video anyway. And so I brought back a lot of the stuff here rather than referring you out to one or another. It makes for a longer video, but sometimes it's nice to just have one big self-contained video, just listen to it. Actually, I do that with a lot of videos that I'll watch kind of in the background, either like as a podcast or whatever. And I don't know, I find it kind of annoying sometimes to go between like smaller segment videos, although like from the standpoint of like teaching and everything, I always kind of talk about having small sort of bite-sized videos. I don't know. I'm not sure because that runs against my intuition, but maybe, who knows, whatever. So we'll see. I hope you like the video. Comment, tell me what you had for breakfast, ask an econ question. I'll give you a response. Anyway, so hopefully this is useful. All right, so one of the first simple models we encounter in an economics course is the circular flow model, which is just a simple representation of the entire economy. The idea is it's trying to show us how things fit together. So we've got people represented as households, we've got businesses represented as firms, and each has a dual role in the model. So households are supplying labor in the factor market, and then firms are buying that resource in the factor market, labor, and then they're using labor to produce output, services or products or whatever, and then consumers are then buying those in the product market, and the businesses are the suppliers, the producers in the factor market. And so, in the product market. So the basic idea is we have the factor market or the resource market for the inputs used in production, and we have households as sellers in that market and firms as buyers. And then we have the product market, the output market, where we have the final goods or services actually produced, and we have the households as buyers in that market. We have firms as producers, as sellers in that market. And so the final products or output market represents things produced by firms and then purchased by households. So households supply labor, then receive income in exchange for their labor. They use that income to support consumption. Firms purchase inputs, such as paying wages, to households. They transform the inputs into whatever is the output that's useful, and then they sell that in the product market. And so it's a really simplified version of the economy. One key limitation is that the circular flow model is completely silent on how prices are set in those factor and product markets. I mean, we assume that they're governed by the forces of supply and demand, and maybe by competitive markets. We actually don't make too many assumptions about the actual market structure, whether it's a competitive market, since those really don't exist, or a monopoly, since those kind of only exist in a certain set of circumstances. We actually don't make further assumptions about the product, about the market structure, or where those prices come from, just that there must be prices. Although that's even an assumption, because there's really nothing stopping us from trying to use a circular flow model to represent a command economy, where you'd have a centralized planner, so long as we still acknowledge that there must be inputs used in production, and there must be final outputs that are produced, and there must be people who are doing the producing and doing the consuming. So anyway, all economies, all societies, all people face scarcity. It's an economic fact of life, and scarcity is what necessitates trade-offs. You can use one resource for one thing or another. You can't use the same unit simultaneously for two purposes. So you've got some time that you can use to study, to watch this video, to work out, to sleep, but you probably can't use that same block of time effectively for simultaneous purposes. Like some of the things in this list you probably could multitask, but not super well. Certainly not like studying and sleeping at the same time, I suppose. Although one time I was taking a nap and I woke up in between studying for a number theory exam, and I woke up out of my nap with the correct answer to the problem set that I was trying to solve. So that was pretty awesome. Sometimes that can happen. If you're working on a hard problem, take a nap and let your subconscious solve it for you. Anyway, so all right, we have two concepts when it comes to trade and exchange: absolute advantage and comparative advantage. What's relevant for trade is comparative advantage. So I want to say that right away. Now, absolute advantage sounds more powerful, though it's not. Absolute advantage is just held by whichever trader can do the most with the least. It means either producing more with the same amount of resources or using fewer resources to produce a given amount. It's just about being the most efficient producer. It's not about saying like who should specialize or anything along those lines. I mean, it's ultimately possible to hold the absolute advantage in everything, and it doesn't mean that that trader couldn't gain from trading. It's not the basis for trade. The basis for trade is comparative advantage, which means being able to produce at the lowest opportunity cost, sacrificing the least to be able to produce whatever is that thing. Now, to determine comparative advantage, we've got to have at least two products, and you've got to have at least two traders, because it's not just like how you're producing one thing versus another, but it's how you're doing this in comparison to some other trader, right? So you hold a comparative advantage when you give up less to produce that thing than does the other trader, when you have the lowest opportunity cost. So when you specialize according to comparative advantage, that's when the traders are able to maximize the amount of joint productivity. We maximize the total amount that can be produced when traders specialize according to comparative advantage. So that's why it's the basis for trade. Because if you have the lowest opportunity cost of producing something, you'd actually, in fact, be literally wasting your time doing anything else. And the idea is you should just specialize in the thing that you're really good at and then trade for the other things, because you'll be able to maximize the total productivity amongst the traders when everybody does that. Mutually beneficial trade is possible whenever traders are able to agree on a price. We call this the terms of trade. It's usually quoting prices in one good in terms of the other. And this is is the terms of trade. It's the price. It's allowing them to obtain the good from the other trader. If you could do this at a lower sacrifice than it would cost you to make yourself, now we've got the basis for mutually beneficial trade. The idea is both traders could presumably make both products, but if you find it too costly to make it yourself in terms of the amount of the other good you're foregoing, you're sacrificing or giving up, if you can get it from the other person for cheaper, that's the basis for trade. So I've got some videos where I'll link up where I take the time to go through the numerical development, or even using the production possibilities frontier. I've got one not using production possibilities frontier to show the basis for trade. For now, I just want to go over the basic concepts. Right, so often we do use the production possibilities frontier model when talking about trade and exchange. The production possibility frontier is just going to collect all the possible combinations of output that could be produced using the available inputs and the current level of technology. Usually we see this in a two-product model, although actually in macroeconomics, you think of the country's long-run aggregate supply curve as a production possibilities frontier that's vertical at the level of full employment, right? Anyway, so the possible amounts of both goods that can maximally be produced using all the resources go to the endpoints of the production possibilities frontier. And so that's the input, that's the endpoints, as if they specialize. It's the maximal amount you could get of one good or the other. And then in between are all the combinations of both goods you can get when you try to get some of both. Points that are closer to the origin, that are inside the frontier, are inefficient. These are points where you're actually not using all the resources possible, and so you could produce more of either or both without incurring a sacrifice. Points beyond the production possibilities frontier are completely unattainable except through trade. And that's the brilliance of specialization according to comparative advantage and mutually beneficial trade that results, which is that the traders are able to obtain and consume a collection of output goods they would not possibly have been able to produce alone if they were self-sufficient. And that's the huge idea in economics, that trade and economic activity need not be a zero-sum game. There doesn't have to be a loser for there to be a winner. There doesn't have to be exploitation. Everyone can win. If we use a straight line production possibilities frontier, this is implying a constant trade-off between using the resources for one of the outputs and the other. So the idea would be the resources that you're using are perfectly suited to each, so that the amount that you're currently producing has no bearing on the rate of trade-off between necessary to get more of one good or the other. Bowed production possibilities frontiers imply an increasing opportunity cost. That would be the case if not all the resources were perfectly suited for both types of production. That's actually probably most realistic. So in a lot of numerical examples, however, we'll assume that you've got when you're computing comparative advantage and you're trying to determine the terms of trade and trying to come up with a bundle that the consumers would trade for, we'll most often assume that the slopes are constant. In my course, unless otherwise stated, I would assume that the slopes are constant. Unless you're given a picture where it's clearly bowed, then obviously it's not. So the slopes represent the opportunity costs. And as long as the slopes are different, there'll be mutually beneficial opportunities for trade between the two traders. Now, that doesn't always have to happen. If you have the same opportunity cost, then there's no one holding a comparative advantage. Remember, comparative advantage is when you have the lower opportunity cost in comparison to some other trader for producing one of the goods. All right, so then we'll talk about the supply and demand model. The basics of supply and demand are as follows. We've got a demand curve that's a collection of the set of plans for consumers. For each possible price, there's a quantity demanded. And then by the law of demand, at higher prices, there's a lower quantity demanded. At lower prices, there's a higher quantity demanded. So if the price falls, quantity demanded rises. If only the prices change, and if prices change, then only the quantity demanded can change. So if we say if price changes, only quantity can change, we have to specify if we're talking about the demand side or the supply side. If we're talking about the supply side and price changes, only quantity supplied can change. But what's happening is if we're talking about the demand side and the price changes, we get a new quantity demanded, a different amount that consumers are going to buy because we've got a different price. What's happening is consumers aren't changing their plans. They're just following them. They're using them. They're following their plans and they're doing something different because their plans are telling them at this other price we do something different, right? The demand curve we can think is a set of plans. The demand schedule is a set of plans that are saying at this price, what's the amount you want to buy? At this other price, what's the amount you want to buy? If we move between the prices, then the amounts we're buying changes as well. In order to get a shift, in order to move the entire demand curve, to shift the entire curve, we have to have something other than price changing. So the real easy way just to remember this is price changing? If so, then you've got a movement along the curve and you got a change in quantity demanded. If it's something other than price changing, or if it's like expected future prices, then what's changing isn't the price, it's your belief, the changes in the belief, or change in the price of a related good. Like if we're talking about Pepsi and there's a change in the price of Coke, yeah, it's a price change, but it's a price in a related good. It's the substitute that's changing. So anyway, so if you have something like a change in the number of buyers, change in consumer incomes, change in consumer tastes and preferences, changes in the price of related goods, changes in expected future prices, now you've got something other than the price of the good changing, and so you can have a shift to the demand curve. And similarly, the supply curve is a collection of the set of plans of suppliers, of sellers. For each possible price, there's a different amount that sellers will bring to the market. There's a different quantity supplied. By the law of supply, at higher prices, we've got a larger quantity supplied. At lower prices, we've got a smaller quantity supplied. I always say sellers like high prices, buyers hate high prices, right? So sellers like high prices. At high prices, there's a larger quantity supplied. From any initial price, if the price rises, quantity supplied rises, that would be a movement up a single supply curve. If price falls, the quantity supplied falls. If only price changes, then only quantity can change. Sellers aren't changing their plans, they're just following them differently. We represent changes in quantity supplied with a movement along a single supply curve. Now, in order to get the supply curve to shift, you've got to have something other than price to change. So our recognizable supply shifters are things like change in the number of sellers, change in the price of important inputs, change in production technology, changes in the prices of related goods the firm could possibly also be producing as an alternative using its resources, and changes in expected future prices. All right, so we've got the things that can cause shifts. Now, suppose you get a shift in the demand curve or a shift in the supply curve. What we're really interested in is what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity. We could take some intuition here. I mean, other things equal, you probably want to be drawing the graph to reinforce this, but we can take some intuition just in terms of like thinking about it verbally. So if demand increases, we're going to expect price and quantity to rise. The way that I think of this is increase in demand means we've got consumers who are competing with each other, driving up the price, and there's going to be a larger amount buying because you've got more interested consumers. If demand decreases, we get price and quantity falling. Now you can just think of consumers losing interest, so the price they're willing to pay falls and the amount actually purchased falls. If supply increases, you can think of the price is going to fall and the quantity is going to rise. Think of flooding the market. Supply is increased. There's a lot more available. There's abundance. You're not going to want to pay that much for it because there's a lot of whatever it is you're trying to buy, but there's going to be a large quantity sold because it's so ever present. Now, if we have a supply decrease, we expect price to rise and quantity to fall. Quantity is going to fall because there's less available, and price gets competed up because of the increased scarcity. If both curves move at the same time, we actually need to consider all alternatives. So we have a circumstance where we know the supply and demand curve are going to, their prediction for price or quantity will agree, and their prediction for the other will disagree. So the effect on either price or quantity is known for sure. The effect on the other one is ambiguous or indeterminate. So I recommend drawing two pictures. Draw one where demand gets a big shift and supply gets a small shift, and draw the other one where demand gets a small shift and supply gets a big shift. So for instance, if we're talking about decreases in demand coupled with a decrease in supply, well, decrease in demand has consumers losing interest, price falls, quantity falls. Decrease in supply has increasing scarcity, price goes up, quantity goes down. They agree on quantity. Decrease in demand and a decrease in supply will both predict a decrease in equilibrium quantity, but the decrease in demand suggests consumers losing interest, so the price falls. The decrease in supply suggests increasing scarcity, so the price rises. Which actually happens? Well, it depends on whichever of the two is the dominant effect on the market. So if demand shifts further to the left, price falls. If supply shifts further to the left, price rises. To be able to discern or delineate between the two, we have to have more information. Otherwise, we just say if we have a decrease in demand and a decrease in supply, we get a decrease in quantity and an ambiguous effect on price. All right, so when I discussed the circular flow model, I mentioned the factor or the resource market, and that comes back as relevant as an extension for the supply and demand model. So it's really the same thing. We typically structure the course so that you're introduced to the supply and demand model for exam 1 or exam 2. You do kind of the comparative statics that I was just mentioning, thinking about what happens to equilibrium, price, and quantity. Then you talk about price controls, taxes, elasticity, international trade, market structures. At the very end of the course, sometimes you talk about factor or resource markets. And the basic idea there is just to emphasize the interdependency between markets. Right? We're familiar with this already through substitutes and complements, right? So if the price of a substitute rises, say the price of Coke rises, then you'd get a decrease in the quantity demanded of the substitute. The decrease in the quantity demanded of Coke would fall, and you get an increase in the demand for the good under consideration. You get an increase in demand for Pepsi. Right? So the price of a substitute rises, you buy less of that substitute, you increase your demand for whatever was the good under consideration. Now, with factor markets, the demand for the resource is derived from the demand for the final product that it's used to produce. So demand for labor is derived from the demand for the products and services those workers produce, right? If there's an increase in demand for medical services, then there's an increase in demand for physicians' labor. Medical services would be the product or the output market, and physicians' labor is in the factor or the resource market. And the same for all resources. Nobody cares about aluminum, for instance. You're not going to just buy aluminum. But if there's an increase in demand for aluminum cans or for aircraft airframes or whatever else, then there's an increase in demand for aluminum. And we'd expect, and this is in the factor market. So the point of delineating between factor market and product market is just to acknowledge there's a relevant relationship between the two that are governing these dynamics. Otherwise, our intuition from the supply and demand model just works just fine. One key detail is realizing that in the factor market, the demand curve is driven by the marginal revenue product. So in the ordinary supply and demand model, the ordinary demand curve, we say the theory of demand is the theory of marginal benefit. It means that the demand curve is driven by the valuation consumers have for each unit of that good. I've got a video, I think I called it like all about demand and supply, or supply and demand explained, or something like this. And I talk about how the vertical height of the demand curve is the willingness to pay for consumers at that amount. And the vertical intercept is the maximal amount people would pay for like whatever is the first unit produced, or the 0th unit produced, or whatever. Now, in the resource market, the theory of factor demand is the theory of marginal revenue product, meaning that the valuation for the factor or the input is driven by the valuation for producers using that thing, right, for each additional unit of that item. Now, the marginal product is just the additional output produced when you hire one more unit of that input. So if you hire an additional worker, it's how much additional widgets I'm able to get. Or I hire another worker at the amusement park, it's how many additional amusement park rides I can offer. Presumably, they're able to give a break to the other people working, keep the machine running, more rides are given in the day or whatever. So that's the marginal product. How many additional rides do I get from hiring one more worker? But we don't just care about the actual output or the productivity, we care what it's worth. And so for this, we need to multiply the marginal product by the market price in the output market, and that gives us the marginal revenue product. That's the market value of the additional production. So that's what represents the value created to the firm for using that additional unit of input. Now, as you might guess, the firm optimizes by hiring up to the point where the marginal benefit of hiring one more worker exactly equals the marginal cost. So what's the marginal benefit? That's just the marginal revenue product. What's the marginal cost? It's just the hourly wage, for instance. So the firm hires hourly labor up to the point where the additional benefit equals the additional cost. What happens when we raise the minimum wage? Well, there's a higher marginal cost. Does it mean we'll hire fewer workers? Well, maybe, but we need many more assumptions. So we need lots more information. It could be we're not currently optimizing and there's capacity to pay more. It could be that the higher wage makes workers try harder because now getting fired is comparatively worse. Or it could be that the higher wage actually is unprofitable, or many other things, right? So that's the factor markets and the dynamics in the factor market. Now, going back to the original supply and demand model, actually we could talk about elasticity in the context of the factor market, but when we know prices rise or fall, we know what direction of quantity is going to result. So if price rises, we know the quantity demanded falls. What elasticity gives us is above and beyond how much the quantity is reacting to the price. So elastic means very responsive, inelastic means not very responsive. We have four key elasticities: price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, income elasticity, cross-price elasticity. So price elasticity of demand is just the percentage change in quantity demanded for a given percentage change in price. Price elasticity of supply is just the percentage change in quantity supplied for a given percentage change in price. Income elasticity is just the percentage change in quantity demanded for a given percentage change in income. And cross-price elasticity is just the percentage change in quantity demanded of some good A for a given percentage change in some price in the price of some good B. So I've got these actually linked up in my video that says all about elasticity. And I go over this with like pictures that kind of talk about the magnitudes and kind of the directions and the interpretation of normal and inferior goods for income elasticity, substitutes and complements for cross-price elasticity, and so on. Relevant to elasticity is the link to revenue. Revenue is just price times quantity. Now, if prices change, by the law of demand, quantity changes. So there's two forces on revenue because it's price times quantity. Price change, also quantity changes. If demand's elastic, we get a smaller price change and a larger quantity change. If demand is inelastic, we get a larger price change and a smaller quantity change. So in order to increase revenue when demand is elastic, we have to lower prices. In order to increase revenue when demand is inelastic, we have to raise prices. Though remember, firms are not often interested in maximizing revenue. They care about maximizing profits, and that's revenue minus costs. So if costs are zero, then the firm wants to maximize revenue because it's the same as maximizing profit. It might seem silly to have talk about cost being zero, or at least marginal cost being zero, but that's perfect for information goods, which is a lot of like internet content and stuff like that, and a lot of other like weather reports, news reports. The price of information, the prediction is, should be driven down to zero because the marginal cost of disseminating information to another consumer is zero. There might be a large fixed cost to make this happen, but the marginal cost, which is relevant for determining the optimizing output for firms, is potentially zero. Okay, I mentioned efficiency earlier. One of our conclusions is that the competitive market, represented by basic supply and demand, produces the most efficient outcome. We measure efficiency by the total economic surplus created in the market. So total surplus is just the sum of consumer and producer surplus. Graphically, it's the area below the demand curve and above the supply curve to the left of the market equilibrium. Consumer surplus measures the gain to consumers. It's the difference between the consumer's maximal willingness to pay and the actual price. So graphically, it's the area under the demand curve and then above the actual price. Producer surplus is the difference between the actual market price and then the costs or the willingness to sell to producers. So graphically, producer surplus is the area below the market price above the supply curve. Then total surplus is maximized if there's no deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is going to correspond to any trades that don't happen. If there ends up being a case that the quantity actually traded is smaller than the equilibrium quantity. So deadweight loss is when there's unconsummated gains to trade. It's basically when the quantity actually traded is smaller than the market equilibrium quantity due to taxes, price controls, externalities, or other things. Typically, the area of deadweight loss is going to be a triangle. It's going to be located under the demand curve, above the supply curve, between the market quantity actually traded and the true market equilibrium quantity. Now, for international trade, the key idea is we typically use the supply and demand model to represent the domestic demand and the domestic supply. Then we represent the world supply or the world price as a horizontal line. So domestic demand, domestic supply, and then world price as a horizontal line. So if the world price is above the domestic equilibrium price, then the country holds a comparative advantage. They can produce at a lower cost. The domestic price is below the world price, so they ought to export. And domestic producers are going to want to do that because they can find consumers, foreign consumers abroad, who are willing to pay a higher price than their domestic consumers. So if the world price is below the domestic equilibrium price, now we've got an importing situation. The country lacks a comparative advantage. They've got higher production costs, and they can gain by importing. One key observation is that with free trade, there's winners and losers. Economists point out that with free trade, winners win more than the losers lose on average. When a country imports, domestic consumers that win, domestic producers that lose. When a country exports, it's domestic consumers that lose and domestic producers that win. And then obviously, whenever there's an importer, there's got to be an exporter on the other side that's facilitating that transaction. One last idea is that with protectionism, just like with tariffs, we'd expect the winners are going to win less than the losers lose, meaning tariffs are inefficient. Tariffs are a tax on imports, and what it's going to do is it's going to raise the price of only the imported goods, but therefore it's going to raise the price of all goods sold in the market because no longer the domestic consumers have to compete as aggressively with foreign producers. So what we would do is we don't draw this as a typical tax. We don't draw a tariff as a typical tax. Instead, we'd shift up the horizontal world price to make it inclusive of the tariff. Now, anywhere the domestic supply curve is lower than the world price or the world price inclusive of the tariff, those domestic producers are able to operate, and those units are not imported, so there's no tariff being paid. Tariff is a tax on imports only. But where the domestic costs are higher, where the domestic supply curve lies above the tariff-inclusive world price, consumers will import the goods instead of buying domestically, and therefore they pay the tariff. So one last idea is the impacts of trade on consumers tend to be pretty widely dispersed. Like, how much do you benefit from international trade? A little bit on everything you buy. But the costs and the impacts on firms tend to be pretty concentrated, right? So entire factories are affected. That's one of the reasons why the arguments for protectionism are so politically attractive often. Another concept we want to talk about is externalities. So externalities are bystander effects. Basically, the idea is that some activities create spillovers that impact those other than the original decision makers. Externalities can be positive or negative. I like to distinguish between primary activities and external effects. So here's an example. If there's smoking in an apartment complex, you've got this as a primary activity. There's costs and benefits to the smoker themselves. There's also bystanders, others living in the apartment complex. The externality is secondhand smoke. It's a negative externality because it decreases the health of the bystanders, might bother them or whatever. Now, there's an important distinction between externalities and unintended consequences. So what matters is who is actually affected. Secondhand smoke is a negative externality because it affects other people. If the smoker themselves get lung cancer, though it's an unintended consequence, it's not an externality. It's a direct harm to the individual. The key is, for externalities, we have to have bystanders. It's like the old question, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, the smoker lives alone and there's no one else affected by the smoke. There's no bystanders, so there's no externality. We can classify goods according to the properties of rivalry and excludability. So rivalry refers to whether one person's consumption of a good affects how much remains in the universe for other people. Excludability refers to whether we can limit who consumes the good to paying customers. This gives rise to private goods, club goods, common resources, and public goods. So for instance, private goods are rival and excludable. In-N-Out Burger's Double Burger is rival because when I eat one, there's one less in the universe for everyone else. And it's excludable because you don't have to buy it to obtain it. Concerts are club goods because they're excludable. You have to pay for admission, but they're non-rival because adding one more person to the concert isn't going to diminish how much remains for other people. Air and water in the environment are common resources. Everyone has full access to the air we breathe and the water around us, but when we use that air or water, it diminishes how much remains for others, at least in a clean form. Of course, there's natural systems where we can replenish things so that they're not overwhelmed, and the problem with common resources is the tragedy of the commons. The resource can get degraded if usage overwhelms its ability to naturally replenish. Public goods are non-rival and non-excludable, like a fireworks display or national defense. So everyone is able to benefit and nobody has to pay. So that's the problem of free riding, consuming without paying. No individual has an incentive to pay, and this leads to too little funding for the public good. All right, so then I'll talk about firm costs and market structures. So a firm's costs are determined by its production process. In the short run, this involves some factors of production whose quantities are fixed and some that are variable. And actually, the short run is defined as the period of time when at least one factor of production is fixed. This is like factory space or capacity. In the long run, all costs are variable just by definition. Basically, the idea is when the firm is able to vary its use of inputs, we've moved to the long run. A fixed factor of production leads to a fixed cost. That's the idea that the firm has some level of the factor, regardless of the output. So it doesn't matter if it produces 1 unit or 1 million. The fixed cost is the same. Average fixed cost decreases with output. Average fixed cost is just fixed cost divided by the amount of output. So if fixed costs are $1,000, you produce 1 unit, average fixed cost is huge. It's $1,000. But if you produce 1,000 units, average fixed cost is small. It's only $1. It's a very separate concept from marginal cost. Marginal cost is the additional contribution to total cost when you produce one more unit of output. Marginal costs are due to the variable cost or variable factors of production and come through the variable cost. There's not a clear relationship between marginal cost and average fixed cost. We know average fixed costs always decline with output. Marginal costs could rise or fall depending on the nature of the production process. Now, when there's a fixed factor of production, we expect to see diminishing marginal returns in the other factors of production because of a bottleneck issue. So think of like a lawn care business. You might have 2 lawnmowers and no workers. Adding another worker is going to really increase your production in terms of the amount of additional lawns you can mow. Actually, production increases quite a bit when you add 2 workers, actually. Now you've got 1 for each mower. And realistically, we probably expect production still increases when we add the 3rd worker. Maybe they give the first 2 workers a break or help with the mowers or refueling or whatever. The 3rd worker doesn't add nearly as much as the first one or even the second. And if we keep adding workers, it's just getting crowded, and now we're paying their wage, but not adding additional lawns that we're able to do, and maybe doing fewer than we could have done without them. So that's because the number of lawnmowers is fixed and we've reached capacity. So in order to really boost productivity, when you've got diminishing returns, you've got to alleviate the diminishing marginal product and labor by adding another lawnmower. Now, as output increases, total variable cost increases. In the lawnmower example, it's because we have to hire more labor to more additional lawns. This first occurs at a decreasing rate, then occurs at an increasing rate. So total variable costs are increasing at a decreasing rate while marginal product is increasing, such as when we're adding the first 2 workers. And then once diminishing marginal product sets in, average or total variable cost increases at an increasing rate, and such as beyond the third worker. Now, all firms maximize profits by producing where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So that's our MR equals MC condition. Now, for a competitive firm, this is just at the marginal revenue equals the market price because they're taking that price as given. And each additional unit sold in the market is going to fetch exactly the market price. So we get price equals marginal revenue equals marginal cost for a competitive firm. For a monopoly firm, you'll get marginal revenue actually having actually decreasing, actually lying below the demand curve. So we'll think of marginal revenue and the demand curve for a linear demand curve as having the same vertical intercept, but marginal revenue having twice the slope. It's being twice as steep, meaning the marginal revenue curve is going to cross the quantity axis at the midpoint of the demand curve. So that's actually at the point of unit elasticity. And anyway, so what this means is if the monopoly firm produces where marginal revenue equals marginal cost and marginal revenue is everywhere below the demand curve, then we go up to the demand curve to find the price. Price is above marginal revenue. So for the monopoly, we get the situation where price is greater than marginal revenue, which equals marginal cost at the optimum. For the competitive market, we find the market equilibrium where price equals marginal revenue equals marginal cost. All right. Once we determine the actual level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, we have to actually determine if the firm wants to produce in the first place in the short run. So for this, we have to compare the market price to the average variable cost. If the price is higher than the average variable cost, the firm is able to transform ingredients into something more valuable than what it's starting with. So it should produce. Even if the price is below average total cost, but it's below average variable cost, the firm is transforming inputs into something that consumers are valuing more than they started with, so it should keep producing. If the price is below average total cost, it means the firm's making a loss because they can't cover their fixed costs. This is like a company that can't cover its rent, but it's able to make enough to be able to pay back to cover the wages and electricity and so on and so forth, and maybe even a little bit more to help cover at least some portion of the rent that they're required to pay until they can change the structure of their lease or shut down entirely. So if the price is below average variable cost, that's not true. Price below average variable cost, the firm's going to shut down and in the short run, exit in the long run. If the price is below average total cost but above average variable cost, they'll produce in the short run, probably exit in the long run. Even if the market's currently in equilibrium, there's other reasons why the firm might ultimately shut down or exit. Shut down is a short run issue, exit is a long run. If demand falls, for instance, we expect some firms are going to need to leave the market. If demand increases, we expect firms are going to enter the market. So for a firm with market power, the profit maximizing price is associated with a level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost on the assumption it's setting a single price. But if it's able to set multiple prices, such as through price discrimination, that's going to be much more profitable. So price discrimination is selling the product at different prices in a way that's not explained simply by differences in production costs. And to be able to engage in price discrimination, the firm needs market power. It also needs information about consumers' willingness to pay, and it needs to be able to block resale between consumers. Can't have somebody that gets a really good deal on one unit turn around and sell it to somebody else. So that's why we see like price discrimination between like children and adults or locals and visitors or something like this. Most markets involve some form of imperfect competition. So usually we have like monopolistic competition, which has a large number of firms producing products that are similar within the same general category, but differentiated within a niche. So the idea is like the restaurant market, where there's a lot of different firms locally selling food, right? But each has their own niche, their own menu, their own collection of consumers that are most devoted to their menu, right? Each seller has at least some market power to set their own prices, but they don't influence the overall restaurant prices in the larger metro area. That's monopolistic competition. We assume there's sufficient barriers to entry to allow for market power, but not nearly as much with standard monopoly, where there'd only be one firm in the market. There's also oligopoly, which has a few strong firms. So it's like it's like airlines or the auto industry or the space industry with SpaceX and Virgin Galactic, and then Jeff Bezos has some blue something, whatever. All right, so the hallmark of oligopoly, though, is mutual interdependence, right? So if one firm makes a change, the rival firms are going to respond and consumers respond. So a good sign of an oligopoly is they mention their rivals by name in advertisements, right? And then their pricing decisions are going to be made realizing that there's a strong cross-price elasticity, right? Cross-price elasticity is going to be positive when firms are substitutes, and probably in oligopoly, there's a cross-price elasticity. Cross-price elasticity is measuring the percentage change in quantity of good A for a given percentage change in the price of good B. There's probably a relatively large and positive cross-price elasticity when we have oligopoly. Large meaning pretty responsive, pretty elastic, because it's easy to go between one airline or the other, for instance. And positive, meaning that they're substitutes, that if price of one rises, the quantity demanded of the other rises because people pursue the substitute when one good's price rises. All right, and then the last thing I talk a little bit about antitrust and then price fixing. Price fixing is completely illegal. It's illegal under the Sherman Act. That's what makes explicit price fixing illegal. There's tacit collusion, which is in the sort of legal gray area. So if the firms aren't explicitly agreeing on price coordination, basically what happens, though, is the antitrust officials are going to get very interested and are going to want to see, is there a compelling business justification for this price coordination, or is there something illicit going on? And so, but the reason why we want to talk about tacit collusion is that's important to be able to recognize for entrepreneurs that might be interested in entering a market. You want to make sure that the prices aren't inflated due to tacit collusion, because then your lower cost structure that you're anticipating is going to mean that you're going to have outsized profits. The market might not be as favorable as you think it actually is when those firms lower their price because they themselves have lower costs, for instance. Anyway, so that brings me to the end of the set of notes here. I hope you enjoyed the video. Good luck on any and all exams. I hope you liked the video, and then I'll see you next time.